Hello and welcome to the Beyond 6 Seconds podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn Keel, and today I'm very excited to have my guest on the show, Ariel Henley. Ariel is a writer from Northern California with a BA in English and Political Science from the University of Vermont and a master's in education from University of the Pacific. She is passionate about writing as a form of activism and hopes to use her story to promote mainstream inclusion for individuals with physical differences. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Narratively. Ariel is also the author of A Face for Picasso, a memoir about growing up with Crouzon Syndrome. Ariel, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, happy to have you here. So, would love to learn more about what it was like growing up with a facial difference and specifically with Crouzon Syndrome. So, and maybe talk a little bit about like what Crouzon Syndrome is in case people aren't familiar and what it was like.
Yeah, absolutely. So Crouzon syndrome is a craniofacial condition where the bones in the head fuse prematurely. So when a baby's born, right, as like a kid gets older, their skulls grow, their faces grow, people get bigger. But with Crouzon syndrome, the sutures are fused. And so I'm a twin, I'm an identical twin, and we both have Crouzon syndrome. So my twin sister Zan and I started having surgery for it when we were 8 months old. And so surgeons would literally have to go in and like break apart our skulls and make them bigger for us. Since our heads and faces did not grow on our own, they had to make it bigger so that our brains had room to grow. And so, as they make the skull bigger, things kind of shift and move around. So then they'd have to go back in and move the eyes and move the nose, fix the jaws. So by the time we graduated from high school, we each had about 60 surgical procedures. So saying that, you would probably assume that my childhood was, I don't know, super unconventional. And in some ways it was, but in a lot of ways it was just like every other kid. We would have our surgeries and then we'd go back to school. We were in public school from kindergarten for most of it anyway. And when we got to high school, we did a little bit of like home teaching because we were on medical leave. And so we'd have a teacher come to our house for like an hour every week or something like that. And then we mostly just did like independent study, but we played sports, we had friends. It was hard in a lot of ways to understand what it meant to have a facial difference and a face that other people felt was wrong and bad. Within our, circle, the people that we went to school with and our friends and our family, they were all used to us. So it wasn't really an issue. And so I would kind of forget that I had Crouzon syndrome and that I had a facial difference. But as soon as we met people that were not used to us, it was a reminder. Like we couldn't go to the grocery store without being stared at. We couldn't go out to dinner with our friends or family without people having, an issue with us and making comments like, look at their eyes, look at their face, look at that girl. And so my whole life has been being stared at and being made fun of and harassed. And I don't even like to use the word bullying because it's more than that. It's more than just being targeted. It's everyone, it's children, it's adults, it's teenagers who would just pick apart everything about us. And so we would go to school. When we'd have surgery, we would leave, have surgery, recover for a little bit, and then go back, usually before we were even healed all the way, because we couldn't miss too much school. And so we didn't really talk about things with peers much. We just kind of pretended that it wasn't a thing. And so we compartmentalized a lot of our experiences. But yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but
it definitely is. And there's so many threads of conversation
right.
I want to follow from here. So yeah, I mean, just starting from the beginning when you were describing the types of surgeries where literally surgeons are like physically like breaking apart your bones and then you're like healing, you and your sister are healing and then like going back to school. I imagine that's got to be like really, it's going to be pretty painful, like almost every time that it happens. So how did you manage through that?
There was a lot of dissociating, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to be completely honest, it was painful, but it wasn't the worst part. Like it was definitely the more of the emotional aspect was a lot harder than the physical, because there were times when we would wake up from surgery and we would look completely different.
Wow.
And not only that, but we are identical twins. And we used to be so identical that if you show me a picture of the two of us together at like age 3, I have no idea which one is me.
Mhm.
Like that is how much we looked alike. And so to not only wake up from surgery with a face that I didn't recognize for myself, but to then not recognize my sister was beyond my ability to process. And no one else around me really understood it either. So it was kind of like, everything's fine, everything's fine. It was a lot of not dealing
Mm.
with things. And so the surgeries were physically painful, but there was definitely the psychological and the emotional aspect that was harder because in addition, it was, if I went in for surgery first, my sister would, say goodbye, knowing that I'm going in, and vice versa. If she went in first, it was, you know, knowing something could go wrong and having that realization even as a child, not having the privilege of being careless and carefree. It was like death kind of always hanging there.
Mhm. Yeah, you always knew it was a serious event and that there was risk involved. So you and your sister were aware of that.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Wow. Because you had this sort of unique situation where you have a twin, your twin sister, who's going through the same surgeries, the same types of treatments, and I assume very similar experiences as you have. So, did
Mhm.
the two of you ever kind of talk about it or commiserate in any way, or was it literally just like we're not talking about this?
We would talk about things sometimes, but I think in some ways the beauty of it was that we didn't have to.
Mhm.
Like we could just sort of grieve together because that's really what it was, grieving. It was like a loss of identity, of innocence, of trying to process these experiences. Yeah, so a lot of the times we would just sort of sit together, sometimes even like cry together, say things like, I'm so tired of this, or like, I don't understand why it has to be this way, things like that. But we didn't really need to go into more details because we could just understand what the other one was feeling and thinking. So in a lot of ways it was, great and a privilege to have someone to go through it with. But in a lot of other ways, I think it was even more traumatizing because there was that added layer of helplessness and fear. It wasn't just about me, it was about both of us and not being able to control what was happening to me, but also what was happening to my sister, and having to see her in physical pain was devastating.
Yeah. Yeah. And at what age did you complete your surgeries? Or when did that stop?
We had our last surgery when we were 19, just before we turned 20.
Okay, wow. Wow. So yeah, that's really marked your whole childhood and growing up is having this reality and this
Yeah.
experience really being part of yours and your sister's lives. Wow.
Yeah. And it was really, going to college, and I came home my sophomore year and I had surgery during the winter break, and it was a pretty minor surgery, but we were supposed to do it like 2 more times. And it was something I wanted. And after that surgery, I was like, no, it doesn't feel worth it to me. Like I had spent the first part of college, like kind of coming into myself a little bit and feeling more comfortable with who I was. And I was like, I don't want to keep putting myself through this if it's not something that's like medically necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. And what was that experience like going to college? Because that's really I would imagine one of the first times that you're going to a completely new area where everyone's new, as opposed to like sort of having your family and the people who know you versus like people who are strangers, like everyone's new. What was that like?
It was very liberating for me. And so I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I went to college in Vermont, so about 3,000 miles away.
Wow.
And I went 3,000 miles away for a reason. And because I wanted to start over, I wanted to be able to drive down the road and not be like, oh, that's a reminder of where I had surgery. And it was like going through the Caldecott Tunnel, I'm 31 now, or almost 31. I'm aging myself a little bit. I'll be 31 in a couple months.
Mhm.
But even now, like driving through the Caldecott Tunnel, like going into Oakland, it triggers me a little bit. It reminds me of being a kid and having surgery. And so going to college, I wanted to go somewhere where people didn't know me, where I didn't know anyone, where they didn't see my face at all the different stages. They didn't see me back at school with stitches and a black eye and swollen and bruised and uncomfortable. And I could just be the version of myself that I wanted to be. And the funny thing about that line of thinking, though, is that no matter where you go, you take yourself with you. And so In a lot of ways, it was great for me because while it definitely didn't fix everything, it gave me the space to process what I had been through and the space to do it away from my family members and my sister. I didn't have to comfort anybody. I could focus on me and my feelings and really process that myself. So it was hard, but I made a ton of friends and it was an amazing experience.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Wow. So yeah, I mean, it's good that people were, it sounds like relatively accepting on the college campus and such, or was that the experience that you had?
You know, yes and no. Some people were, I think it was like anywhere. So I grew up in the East Bay and, you know, in a very beauty obsessed area. And so it wasn't that level. There wasn't this pressure to get plastic surgery if you don't look a certain way. That wasn't present, but it certainly wasn't the case where I could walk down the street and not get stared at. I still got stared at. I still had people make comments about me, but I think what was different was that I wasn't as open to criticism. I didn't care.
Mhm.
Because like that's your problem. And so I really had this mindset of I'm not going to let other people's opinions and actions impact how I feel about me. If I'm okay with me, great. And of course, easier said than done sometimes, but for the most part, that was what really changed for me.
Oh, and that's powerful because sometimes that's a really tough place to get to in your life, no matter what your experience is in life. So it's a good place to be once you get there. So that's good. That's really
Yeah.
good. So wow. So you went on, you graduated college, you went on to get a master's, and you work full time. And now very recently you just released your memoir, A Face for Picasso. So I guess going back, what inspired you to want to write a memoir about your experiences?
Yeah, so when I was 12 years old, the summer before seventh grade, my twin sisters, Anne and I, had two operations that really changed what we looked like again. And it was hard because it was middle school, and middle school is not exactly great for a lot of people, whether you have a facial difference or not. But it was a summer of really traumatic surgeries and recovery, and then trying to go back to school and get back to normal
Mhm.
felt impossible. For me, it kind of marked this before and after period. It was like I was no longer the same person anymore. It changed me physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, in every way imaginable. I was different and I was angry about it. That is how I processed everything that I had been through. Is I was pissed off
Mhm.
at everyone and people, even teachers, principals, vice principals, students were awful to me.
Mhm.
Absolutely awful, very discriminatory. There were a lot of like microaggressions, even, and some were just straight up aggression. Like it was very problematic and hard to deal with. And I remember being in seventh grade, and one of the assignments that my teacher gave us was to write a short story. And it could be about anything, but just fiction, short story. Okay. So I was having a hard time because no matter what I wrote, it always came down to me wanting to write my story. And it was like I was going through so much and I had no idea how to deal with it or navigate it. And so I wrote about it. And so the story I wrote wasn't, my story necessarily, but it was my story in disguise. I got really great feedback from the teacher, and he gave me an A and said, you might have a future as a short story writer. And I was so desperate for some kind of meaning in my life that I really took that and I ran with it. And I said, one day I'm going to write my story. I'm going to tell my story. I had no idea memoirs were a thing at the time. So I was like, maybe it'll be fiction, pretend fiction, and I'll just say it's a fake story, but it will really be mine. And then as I got older, I began to document everything that I experienced and was going through. And I kept journals knowing that one day I wanted to tell my story. But to kind of back up a little bit, when my twin sister and I were kids, we were interviewed by the French edition of Marie Claire. And in the article, our faces were compared to a Picasso painting. So think cubism, eyes over here, a nose over here, a mouth over here. And I remember at the time, because I was in elementary school, and I remember at the time thinking how special I felt, to be interviewed by these fancy journalists, and they took pictures and they
Mhm.
interviewed us and we got dressed up, and it was exciting. And I never read the article until after that summer of operations in 7th grade. And so I happened to find the article after going through all this stuff, and I was in a dark place and I was just cleaning out the attic and I found it. And so I started kind of translating it, and I saw that comparison, and it just fueled my anger even more. And that's really what drove me to write about it, was just trying to make sense of things and also find a deeper meaning within, myself and everything I've been through.
Oh, that just it sounds so devastating to find out that way. And I guess, is that where the title of your book comes from?
Yeah.
That article.
Yeah. And so it really, A Face for Picasso, unpacks growing up with a facial difference and my relationship with my twin sister and my family, and also the way society treats women and looks at beauty and the emphasis that it places on physical beauty. It really looks at all of those things and unpacks it through the lens of this comparison to Picasso.
Oh, wow. And yeah, one of the things that you talk about is face equality, which actually was something that I hadn't heard of until I started reading more about your story. So I'd love to learn more about what that is and how that ties into your book and your story.
Yeah, so face equality is basically just the idea that people should be treated equally and have equal opportunities regardless of what they look like. So that includes disfigurements or facial differences, burns, scars, anything outside of the quote norm, really. People who meet these arbitrary standards of beauty, which are, Western standards of beauty, I should say, which are ageist, sexist, classist, racist, all of these things, make more money. They're treated better. There's this idea that our physical appearance is somehow representative of who we are. So if you talk about things like identity, what's the first thing we think of? The appearance of someone's face. And this goes back forever, really, that we can judge a person by what they look like. And there, our entire like pseudoscience beliefs that the face is indicative of someone's moral character, and so someone's going to be more trustworthy if they look a certain way, and they're going to be smarter if their head is shaped a certain way. And so face equality really examines kind of the role that some of those beliefs play, because if you talk to people about this, people will be like, I don't think that, like, that's wild, what? But it's so deeply ingrained that a lot of people don't even realize how harmful a lot of these stereotypes are and how ingrained they are into our practices. Like, look at villains in movies.
Mhm.
Freddy Krueger, scarring, facial differences. That is how you know it's the bad guy. Scar in The Lion King, which is for children, is the bad guy. And he's literally named Scar. Like, that is, he's bad. And so face equality, again, just kind of tackles all of those things and says it shouldn't matter what we look like. It shouldn't matter if we meet or don't meet these arbitrary standards of beauty. We are all people. We all deserve to be treated as such.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's really powerful. And you mentioned that you talk about that a lot in the book, is sort of these problematic depictions of facial differences in the media, which is again something that you grow up with it, and it's almost like you don't even think about it. It's just, oh, this is just how it's depicted in the media. But if you really stop to think about it, it's like, they're
Yeah,
taking like that physical like appearance shortcut to indicate something about someone's character, and that just isn't right.
absolutely. And it's hard to grow up with that, especially as someone who could not go into a bookstore or go anywhere again where I saw someone like myself. There was no, there was no representation for someone with Crouzon syndrome
Mhm.
growing up. And so when I saw characters like Scar or, any villain who looked different, there was this kind of internalized belief that I deserved to be stared at when I was in public, and I deserved to be harassed and to be made fun of because I was different. And that's the price that you pay when you are different. There is something wrong with me. I am wrong. And so those depictions really just reinforced that line of thinking. And it's very damaging to a child, especially when there are no other narratives to counter that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It influences anyone who has a facial difference or just doesn't live up to the standards of beauty that we have in Western society at all. And then, yeah, and it influences everybody else who just sort of has that in their subconscious mind. And yeah, it kind of fuels that sort of staring at and strange about differences. So yeah, that is a big one there. Wow. So your memoir, is it sort of like interspersed with some of your and your sister's stories growing up with sort of talking about some of these bigger issues around representation and face equality?
In some ways, I tried to really take readers inside of my experiences and walking through, going into kindergarten even, and my sister would apologize to her teacher for being ugly and apologize to her classmates for them having to look at her, basically. So things like that. And then being made fun of at the school Halloween parade where it's like everyone's supposed to be able to dress up. And it's like, no, our appearance isn't okay even on Halloween when people are wearing masks, and kind of walking through, into middle school and talking about the operations we had, joining the cheerleading team, the ableism that we experienced in school, but without calling it out specifically, because I really wanted readers to feel like they were experiencing it and not just tell them it's bad to treat people like this but to make them feel it. I really wanted people to have a deep understanding of what it means to be different. It isn't just, oh, I don't like the way that I look. It's like, no, Crouzon syndrome isn't the problem. It's the way I'm treated by society that's the problem. And so unpacking that ableism in that way. And so it's more literary in that sense. It is an intense book. I've had an intense life. Like I will totally own that. But I did try to write it in a way, and this is partially why I was really drawn to it technically being a young adult memoir, although it's targeted toward teenagers and adults alike. But I wanted readers to be able to read it and not feel like they were getting secondhand trauma from reading it. I didn't want it to be so heavy that it was like, oh my gosh, I'm just overwhelmed now. Like I have to process this. So it's kind of a balance between showing and telling in that way. So my answer to your question is yes, a lot of those issues are incorporated, but it's not as direct as you might expect.
Yeah, I think that sounds like it's a good balance, because it is hard to share an experience like that with, as you said, it being like really heavy and kind of getting that secondhand trauma or impact, but at the same time not being like lectury. Because I guess a lot, sometimes people get really defensive for some reason when they're called out on things that their biases that they may not realize that they have. So it sounds like that yours really balances out with the story.
I tried to be very honest in my story, and that includes honest about myself and my own responses to things. It's definitely not a story where you're going to read it and think, wow, Ariel thinks she's this like little angel and everything bad has happened to her. Like I was mean. I did not handle things well. Like I would get mean at times. That was my trauma response. And so having to unpack some of that anger as well. And a lot of what the book does is look at how ingrained beauty standards are. And in comparing it to a Picasso painting, or comparing it to Picasso, I should say, I talk about Picasso and his life and his really problematic views on women and how abusive he was. And because especially being compared to a Picasso painting, I had this idea that to be compared to a Picasso painting, because I did not understand the idea of separating the art and the artist. To me, I was like, that's not a thing. Like everywhere I go, I am my face. Like you can't just decide what version of yourself people see. Like everything I did was an extension of me and what I looked like. And so to compare me to a Picasso painting really felt like I was being compared to Picasso. And so especially as I was growing up and I was dealing with the trauma of everything, and I was really struggling with how angry I was about all of it, I felt like a Picasso. I started to internalize this idea that I was abusive and I was cruel the way that Picasso was. And because he was very abusive towards women. And instead, I wasn't realizing that I was actually one of, I guess in this comparison, one of Picasso's mistresses or wives, because they were so abused and I was abused by the world around me. And so did I always handle things well? No, but it helped me to understand that there's a difference between anger and rage.
Yeah.
And it's okay to be angry. When you're being abused, it's okay to be angry. It's up to you to like work through that trauma and figure out a healthy way to express that and deal with that. Absolutely. But yeah, that comparison just really helped me to understand my own journey and kind of forgive myself and the people around me, and also talk about, again, how deeply ingrained beauty standards are in our society.
Yeah. Wow.
That was a lot.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's powerful. Cause yeah, I didn't really know much about Picasso's like personal life or what he was as a person. So to know that and understand how that impacted you and to have that wound into the story, like, yeah, wow. You mentioned earlier that you and your sister and your family didn't really talk about your Crouzon syndrome that much growing up. So now having this forum or just sort of making this decision to really come out and share your story, I'd imagine that that is, somehow at least cathartic or therapeutic or helping. It just seems like a turning point in some way.
Yeah, my family's been incredibly supportive. I have a lot of writer friends who do not have supportive families when it comes to telling stories that, and I admit this, it isn't just my story. It's my sister's story, my family's story. It's their story through my lens, and that's the cool thing about memoir. If they were going to write their own, it wouldn't be the same as mine. It's going to be different because that's how memory and life and experiences work, which is great. But my family has known that I've wanted to write this book since I was 12 years old. And so even growing up, my parents would be like, oh, it's another story for the book whenever I didn't feel like doing something. And so it was my way of showing up for life and their way of really encouraging me to go do things. It was like, worst thing that can happen is it's just one more thing to write about, Ariel. And so if I wasn't writing regularly, my dad was like, you said you want to be a writer, writers have to write, like, come on, get to it, very loving and very supportive. And it's led to a lot of really great conversations with them, and a lot of healing, I think, has happened.
Yeah, definitely. And that's great that they were supportive and that they encourage you to write constantly. Because, yeah, I mean, it said writers have to write. So
right, exactly.
Preparation for that. Very cool. So, yeah, so I know your book literally just came out. We're talking in early December and it came out like last month. So it's very, very new. What kind of goals do you have for either your writing or just your advocacy around, face equality and challenging beauty standards?
Yeah, I had someone on Facebook tag me in a photo of their daughter who also has a craniofacial condition, who looks a lot like I did when I was a kid, holding my book in Barnes and Noble. And I started crying, immediately started crying. And to me, that's what I wanted. That was the only thing I wanted, was for people like me to be able to walk into a store and say, there is something here for me. I belong here. My goal really is to get my story in as many hands as possible, especially into the hands of people who grew up similarly to me, so kids with craniofacial conditions. It is my dream to have my book read in schools. As every writer, I'm sure, would say, but not about me, not about my book, but to start that conversation early, and so that people really start to understand the impact of discrimination against people with disabilities and facial differences, and so that people can walk down the street and go out to dinner and go grocery shopping without being stared at and harassed and made fun of. Like, it's exhausting. So my goal really is to just keep doing what I'm doing, and hopefully more and more people will listen and care. I am working on additional books, fiction this time, but I want to keep writing about characters with facial differences to kind of help normalize that, but not have it be like a key aspect of their identity. Like, she has brown hair and Crouzon syndrome and brown eyes, just to help normalize it.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Yeah, that's powerful. What is an educational tool for people so that, again, people aren't, it's not something that gets stared at people are just not exposed to, but also really that representation. So it's like you're providing that representation that you didn't really have growing up, and now other kids with Crouzon syndrome or other facial differences can see that as a great example.
Yeah, exactly. And I've had some doctors and even a couple of mental health professionals reach out as well to talk about how my book has helped them better understand the trauma
Wow.
around these experiences. And so that's been really incredible as well, to kind of shift some of the conversation there, so that when patients do go in for surgery or do have one of these conditions, it's not just about, okay, let's expand the skull. It's, okay, well, let's, get these kids in therapy and let's get talking about this and help them actually work through this and process it. So that's been really amazing.
Oh, wow. That's great. Yeah, just hearing directly from people who have gone through it, and it will definitely help them, the next generation of kids and even adults who have to face these issues. Wow. Oh, that's so cool. Wow. Well, Ariel, thanks so much for being on my show. How can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your book or buy your book?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and share a little bit about my story. I have a website, arielhenley.com. People can find me there. You can send me an email at arielhenley.com, or if you Google A Face for Picasso or go to any bookstore, you should be able to find my story.
Very cool. And I'll put your website link in the show notes so people can find it there. And yeah, as we close out, is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know, or anything that they can help or support you with?
Just read diverse stories, celebrate diverse appearances. I think just talking about these issues is a great start. And so I appreciate any listener that has taken the time to hear my story and think about what face equality and facial difference means. So thank you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Ariel, for sharing your story and for educating me and all of us more about face equality, and just, really thinking about the impact of beauty standards and providing that representation. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.